Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. This is Bill Maddox from the University of New Hampshire, Carsey School of Public Policy in Durham, New Hampshire. I want to welcome everybody to another in our series with Plan International of webinars, where we explore a number of issues related to development, mostly from a savings group angle. I'm really excited about today's webinar, and in a minute I'll introduce the webinar and who our guests will be. I want to make a couple of quick announcements. First of all, to let you know that we are using a new platform today, Zoom. We're very excited about this webinar platform. Hopefully it'll work well for you. Seems to be working well for us so far. Just a couple of navigation tips. We will be using the Q&A box. So if you need to communicate with us, then look for the little Q&A in the bottom of your screen. We also are going to be doing a couple of polls, or actually 3 polls during the course of the webinar. So please pay attention to the polls and participate. These polls help us to gauge a little bit about what you know about the topic, what kind of work you're doing, and give our speakers a little bit of a cue in terms of their presentation. I want to make a few announcements about some important things that are going on in SMDP world over the next few months. We are going to continue with the Carsey Plan webinars. We'll have another webinar in June with Paul Rippey and John Schiller. The topic and the title is still in discussion, but it's going to be very exciting and very interesting topic, I can promise you. So watch your email. We will be in the website, the SMDP Plan webinar website, and we will be updating with that information and hopefully be able to announce some more webinars in August, September, and October. The next important thing I want to let you know is we are getting ready for some planning for some SMDP workshops. The next workshop will be SMDP Togo, which will be in French. It's a savings group workshop that is co-sponsored by Maine, the Microfinance Association in Africa, and Plan, and will be taking place June 20th through July 1st at the Novella Star Hotel in Lomé, Togo. It's an excellent location, a really terrific workshop. We've had very good reviews on it, and we'll include a field visit to look at some savings groups near Lomé. The other thing I'd like to let you know is we're going to have a repeat of our online course. It was very popular last year, Savings Group, Building Scale and Impact Through Adaptation and Experimentation, with Nancy Lee, the facilitator. We'll probably announce the date of this in a few weeks. I think we'll be looking at October for a startup, and it'll go until maybe February of next year. And it will be totally online, not a blended course as we did last time. So more information about that, and scholarships should be available for that as well. Finally, we're looking at SMDP workshops in cooperation with VSL Associates in Tanzania in October, in Egypt with VSL Associates and Plan in Egypt, November, December, and then in Zambia with VSL Associates next March. All of these workshops I mentioned, the Togo, the online workshops, and the 3 in Tanzania, Egypt, and Zambia are all going to have available MasterCard scholarships, we're pretty sure. So watch your email. We will be announcing this soon. So now to today's webinar. We're really pleased to have with us 3 different Plan International staff who are going to be talking about a really important topic to anybody who is involved in development. Last fall, the United Nations Sustainable Development Summit, with 193 nations represented, adopted the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which includes a set of 17 Sustainable Development Goals to end poverty, fight inequality and injustice, and tackle climate change by 2030. They're ambitious goals. They're goals that are, I think, quite different from the Millennium Development Goals that we were familiar with and were being the center point of a lot of development work. I think in many ways the Sustainable Development Goals are more visionary and are more all-encompassing. We're really very pleased to have with us today Stephanie Conrad, who's a head global advisor for Plan International Headquarters, John Schiller, who's Plan's global advisor for savings groups, and Amanda Lundy, who's advocacy advisor for Plan International. Amanda leads the global strategy development and country support for organizations' advocacy on implementation of the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. And she actually was a participant in the process of negotiating these goals and seeing them come to fruition last fall. So I'll be very happy to hear from her. So without further ado, I'm really happy to introduce John Schiller for what is going to be a very interesting webinar. Just to let you know that after the presentations of our three presenters, we will open it up to questions. So use your Q&A box on the bottom of your screen and type in your questions. You can start typing questions at any time during the webinar when the questions arrive in your brain, and then I will open up the Q&A about 3/4 of the way through the webinar, so we can start getting some of your questions answered by our esteemed group of panelists here. So John, I'm really happy to turn it over to you, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks to all the participants. Good day to everyone, and thank you for devoting an hour of your busy day to this topic. Before we get into the theme of the webinar per se, I'd just like to provide a little context on how Plan has evolved with the savings groups movement. We began doing this back in 2003 when we discovered the methodology in Niger through CARE. And at the time, we were dissatisfied with the more classic microfinance model that was based on microcredit. We didn't feel that it was reaching vulnerable enough people. We had trouble bringing our programs with MFIs up to scale. And we were looking for an approach that, that served more vulnerable people and promised the opportunity to achieve really great scale. Our objectives at the time were really, I guess you'd say, rather narrow, because we were focused mostly on improving the financial condition of households, helping with money management, helping build financial assets, and it was limited pretty much to that. Even so, the response from communities was very encouraging, and it led over the years to the spread of savings groups programming through Plan to 30 countries, and eventually reaching where we are now at about 1.4 million members. In the process of doing this over the years, we began to develop other ways of looking at savings groups, and we were identifying other opportunities for having impact through them. And as many of you have discovered, those of you who are doing savings groups, they're very effective as platforms for disseminating messages, for doing trainings, for doing other forms of capacity building, for organizing other kinds of activities in communities to reach greater socioeconomic impact. So that was one way. A second way was that we discovered that they were a very effective way of promoting financial inclusion among young people. And that in fact, you could, by organizing young people into savings groups, you could teach them about money management, you could help them build assets, and then you could also deliver a whole host of other important non-financial services built around essential life skills. At the moment, we are at a point where we're sort of reassessing once again, and we're seeking yet further mostly social impact and change through the human rights approach that Plan, human rights-based approach rather, that Plan has recently adopted as part of its global strategy. And we find that the Sustainable Development Goals are a fantastic foundation, a good underpinning for conceptualizing our objectives around how one achieves greater equality and greater social justice. and for helping us realizing these things, helping us design programs that feature savings groups. So the focus of the discussion today is going to be on the Sustainable Development Goals and how these can influence the design of programs. And before I hand the floor over to Amanda, we have a poll. Bianca? Just to get an idea of how familiar you, the participants, are with these goals. So we're asking you to respond to how much you already know about the SDGs. And the choices are nothing, a little bit, but you can't really explain too much. You're fairly well versed, but you're open to knowing more. And an expert. I've made presentations about the SDGs, and I'm very familiar. So we'll take about 10 or 15 seconds and ask you to just tick the box that applies to your situation. Okay, Bianca, can we show the results?
Sure, I'm sharing them right now.
All right, so very few know nothing. Only one is an expert, and as expected, the rest of us are in the middle, which is where I'd put myself as well. So this is a good foundation for Amanda's presentation. And Amanda, I turn the presentation over to you.
Thanks so much, John. Can we go to the next slide, please? Wonderful. So hello, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you online in the morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are. As Bill said, I am advocacy advisor here at Plan International, and I lead our work around the SDGs. So I've been working on the Sustainable Development Goals in one form or another for about 4 years now. So I feel like I firmly fall in that fourth category, but there's always more to learn about them. So I'll give an overview of what the SDGs really are, and we'll try and look at some of the differences between the SDGs and the Mdgs, the Millennium Development Goals, and then just think a little bit more about how they link to the topic of discussion today. So what's in the SDGs that relates to savings groups, and what's in the SDGs that talks about social inclusion and then social equality. So just to start at the very beginning, as you can see in front of you, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And that's big, and they range from protecting ocean ecosystems to quality and resilient infrastructure, to inclusive decision-making, and governance processes. They are vast and wide-ranging, and the process to arrive at them was equally vast and very different from the MDGs. So if we can just go to the next slide, Bianca. Perfect. So just to give you a sense here, you can see the size of the Millennium Development Goals in contrast, right? Those are just 8 goals that essentially focus on social development issues: education, health, hunger, poverty. And there's one goal there around environmental sustainability that really didn't get a lot of attention or push on it. And you could say that equally to some of the global partnership discussions. So quite a narrow global framework for development that really was written essentially in the corridors at the UN by a very small group that was probably predominantly made up of men and technical experts in development. And it was very much seen as an agenda for developing countries in the global south, and should therefore guide both what those governments focused on, but also what donors in the global north were funding. And we saw it influence huge resource flows Canada, for example, made maternal mortality one of their major issues and funneled lots of money in through that and presented themselves as a champion of goals 4 and 5. So it really did shape, especially the way that donors gave funding, and had the biggest impact really on developing countries who were particularly dependent on those aid flows. In contrast, the Sustainable Development Goals, which, as Bill mentioned, were adopted last year in September at a summit, are much bigger. They're looking at social issues, economic issues, and civil and political rights issues, so you can see. So they're comprehensive, and they intentionally emphasize the links across these multiple different sectors. So it's a much more holistic approach and a much more nuanced understanding of how development happens and the impact of environmental and economic conditions and social and political rights conditions on these other more kind of social development issues like education or health that we would focus on. They're also crucially and very differently universal. So the goals within the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, are intended to be relevant for the UK just as much as Uganda. They talk about issues of income inequality, which we know is huge in many of the countries in the global north. It talks about climate change, which is a massive problem all over our world, right? So it's much less of a kind of donor-driven agenda, an us and them type of agenda. It really is meant to be something much more holistic and owned by everyone, and a sort of plan for everyone. They're also much more transformative in the sort of language that they use. And so they talk really about being focused on people. They talk about being grounded in human rights commitments. They talk about this, there's of course a whole goal around gender equality that talks about gender in a much more transformative way, thinking about things like unpaid care work, rather than just looking at gender parity rates in education, for example. So that's much more comprehensive. I mentioned that this comprehensive element, so it's looking at integrating social, economic, and environmental. And then lastly, and really importantly, which I'll come back to later, it talks about leaving no one behind. And leaving no one behind became a buzzword throughout the entire negotiation process around the SDGs. It was originally in response to the fact that whilst huge progress was made in some of the Millennium Development Goal areas, it was often made by governments trying to focus on what might be called the lowest hanging fruit, the easiest people to reach and to try to increase their indicators or their rates on. So rather than trying to get children with disabilities or children in very rural areas or children in conflict scenarios into education. They're focusing on the ones that are perhaps in urban or peri-urban areas that are easier to reach, that just need a little bit of a push and a little bit more investment to reach. Sustainable Development Goals, in contrast, in the 4th paragraph of the entire framework, say that they will endeavor to reach the furthest behind first, and that they will leave no one behind. And that really is a massive shift in the way that these governments are talking about development, and the need to reach those that are continuing to be left behind in this type of progress. I just want to briefly, if we just go to the next slide, talk a little bit about the process that got us to arrive to this. And I won't go in great detail because it was huge and very complex and took a very long time. But I think there are a few things that are very important about it. One is it was unprecedented as a process, as a government, as an intergovernmental process in its openness. So governments started discussing this about 3 or 4 years before they actually adopted the goals. They started to debate what should be in them. A small group of governments put together a proposal. And that was called the Open Working Group. And they put together an initial proposal and were incredibly open to civil society inputs. There were dedicated slots for civil society to come and present evidence during that point. There were regularly, the government delegations were regularly accepting recommended language from civil society. The private sector was invited into the room also to give their own opinions, particularly around some of the goals like decent work or industry and infrastructure. And so it's a much more owned agenda than the MDGs. There have been millions of people who've been able to have their voices heard as these goals were being developed. And that includes a massive global survey that had about 10 million people involved in it, talking about what their biggest priorities were in their own countries. And so this is big, and it shouldn't be seen as a solely top-down or UN-led agenda, the way that the Millennium Development Goals were. There were huge debates amongst civil society and with governments to get to the agenda that we got now. And it's not perfect, but it really does represent a number of different groups that were fighting for particular issues. To get in here is very important, and it's much more holistic than it would have been without that process. The second thing I want to highlight is just that as a sector, as development professionals that we all are, it really caused quite a lot of introspection amongst ourselves about what we stand for. How does a big INGO that focuses on social development issues like Plan has previously, this kind of discussion challenges us to think a little bit more about how do we connect to environmental issues? How do we connect to some of the economic issues? And I think most civil society organizations involved in the Sustainable Development Goals and in that negotiation process were forced to do that kind of inward-looking reflection process and think about what is the future of development and how do we really see ourselves in 15 years' time if we've been successful as organizations as well. And I think that's quite exciting. So if we go on to our next slide, Bianca. Great. So just to zoom in for a second, because all of that was quite high level, let's look at how financial services and inclusion is captured in the MDGs versus the SDGs. So in the MDGs, as I'm sure all of you know as practitioners, there was no explicit mention whatsoever of access to financial services or its connection to poverty reduction. And that's obviously, as I say, despite the commitments to have the proportion of people who are in extreme poverty and to achieve full and productive employment. And we know through your work, of course, that financial services and financial inclusion can have an effect on the achievement of those targets. In contrast, you'll see I've put particular targets from the SDGs. So 1.4 means it's the first goal and the fourth target within that goal. That's a commitment to ensure that all men and women have equal rights to economic resources and financial services, including microfinance. So that's a very specific calling out of the importance of financial services within the goal on ending poverty. You can also see in Goal 8, which is on decent jobs and economic growth, that there are two targets in there that have specific language around access to financial services and its connection to decent job creation, and that's really important to see. Lastly, I just put a note, just almost because I ran out of space actually to capture all of the times where financial services and inclusion are put in the SDGs. It's also mentioned in Goal 5, which is around gender equality, so women's access to these services. In Goal 2, around hunger, which talks about farmers' access to financial services, and it's also in sustainable industrialization, which is Goal 9. So if you think about the move and the changes in the way that the sector is thinking about this approach and thinking about savings groups, which isn't called out specifically, but can be seen in some of this language, you see a massive shift in the way that this is thought about as contributing to multiple areas of sustainable development. So if we go to the next slide, Bianca. Thanks. So I know I mentioned this before, but I just think it's it's huge, and it's one of the biggest differences, as I said, between the Millennium Development Goals and the SDGs, and that's this commitment to leave no one behind. You can see I've pasted the exact text there from paragraph 4. I think what's important here is that it's not talking about just education, or it's not just talking about adaptation to climate change. By putting it right up here at the top of the entire framework, it's saying that every single step that governments take, that organizations take, that private sector takes to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals and their targets needs to have this focus on leaving no one behind. So it's not good enough to just reach the lowest hanging fruit. And that's in absolutely every part of the goals. So again, thinking about financial inclusion and financial services, leaving no one behind is the framer for the approach to those targets. Next one, please, Bianca. Great. So we've got this framework. It's big, it's hefty, it's 17 goals and 169 targets. So what in the heavens do we do with that? And what are governments doing about that? So their next steps are taking two big forms. One is around implementation, and you can see I've put the text in there that sort of directly links to this. National governments, all 193 national governments at the United Nations signed up to deliver the Sustainable Development Goals, but it's not binding. That's just the nature of this type of agreement at the UN. But they did commit within the framework that they all signed up to integrate these goals and targets into their own national planning and policies and strategies. What's exciting is that this is the time where what's quite a lofty global agreement gets translated into something very real that impacts the communities that many of us work with at national level. So there are many governments. Colombia has been a very early mover. Uganda's been quite an early mover. So has Kenya. So has the Philippines. All of these governments have set up some kind of interministerial committee within their government that is looking across all of their existing national strategies and policies and trying to identify where the big gaps are. So if they just committed to ensure that every child completes a quality and free primary and secondary education, does their education policy commit to delivering that? And what are the gaps in order to get there? So this is a big opportunity and a moment for advocacy, and that's where I really focus my work within Plan International. The second element that governments will be starting to look at much more, probably in 2 or 3 years' time more than right now, is this monitoring element. So governments will be reviewed at global level regularly. They will also, though, be expected to conduct national level reviews and involve civil society in those reviews that looks at how they're doing. So there are hundreds of indicators across each of the targets and goals that we've looked at. So how are the governments measuring up against some of these? How well are they doing? And what needs to be done to change that? So much like a human rights monitoring process, there will be a global level SDG monitoring process, and Plan is working to try and make sure that those are mutually reinforcing and connected. But this is another entry point where governments will be expected to implement, and if they don't, they are going to be monitored on that. And there will be ways then for civil society, both at national level, but also at global level, to work to try and hold their governments to account for those promises that they made at global level in the Sustainable Development Goals. So with that, I will hand over now to Stephanie.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. And thanks a lot, Amanda, for this great introduction to the Sustainable Development Goals and their link with financial inclusion. Bianca, if you move to the next slide, I'd like actually to pick up on one of the slides that Amanda already showed us, which I believe gives us a really great introduction of what I believe the key challenge for savings groups methodology is or will be in the coming 15 years and probably beyond. And that is actually the question, how can savings groups transform from being a methodology that fix household economic problems to one that works towards achieving greater equality and social justice in a much more systematic way. But before we start exploring this question, let's do another poll. Bianca, if you move on, that will actually help me to find out a bit more about how you have been probably engaged with this question yourself. So if you see the poll here now, could you please let us know whether you have been involved in designing savings groups programs? You can just take 10 seconds to click either yes or no, and then Bianca will show us the results. I think we should be good. I think, Bianca, if you can just give us the results. Oh, great. It's a great mix, actually. We have about almost 60% of people who have been involved in designing savings groups programs, and a bit over 40% who haven't. And that's a good thing. That helps me actually to stay on course with my presentation, and I don't have to modify a lot. Bianca, can you move on to the next one? So please, all of you who have actually been very actively engaged in designing projects or in implementing savings groups projects, would you please let us know what the main purpose or the primary goal of your savings group project was? Was it to increase family savings and income raising potential? Was it about increasing family investment in social services, in the hope that families would spend more money on health or education for their children, for example? Was it to promote social norm change, like creating greater gender equality? Or was it about mobilizing members for social change, for example, as part of other community development activities? You can only choose one, so please concentrate on the primary goal of your initiative. Bianca, would you like to show us the results? Great, and that's pretty much what I actually suspected. Indeed, savings groups methodology is essentially a methodology that has been developed to increase family savings and income raising potential. However, it is often also implemented with secondary goals or hopes. Bianca, if you move us on to the next slide, please. And I believe actually that is a particular challenge, because from our observation, at least in Plan, we have seen that there's a certain level of myth that accompanies savings groups methodology about whether or how far they do contribute to greater equality and the achievement of human rights. And I believe that this has to do essentially with the fact that the methodology is widely applied targeting women. We know most of savings groups participants are actually women, which makes us believe that it is conceived to actually address gender inequalities, but also that its benefits are closely connected with increased investments in health and education, which is then associated with the realization of human rights. But let us examine actually a bit closer what savings groups actually do and what they don't. And a simple fact is that they don't automatically contribute to greater equality, neither social nor economic. Essentially, savings groups methodology enables poor and vulnerable populations to increase savings and income generating potential. and thus to become more resilient to economic shock. And I believe you, in the poll we just saw, that this indeed is still, for the majority of savings groups interventions, indeed the primary goal. We also know from various evaluations that they strengthen financial and economic skills of members. So there's an element of capacity development on how to manage their people's household money and how to better manage their money. And we also know that definitely savings groups strengthen trust and solidarity amongst each members. And that is fundamental actually to the principle about how savings groups are put together, because in principle they are put together by people choosing members who they trust to be part of their own savings group. And finally, we also know that there is a positive spin-off with the increased availability of money that is a result of participation in savings groups, in investments in health and education. And I'm not sure actually whether this is equally the case for savings groups that do include only men, or whether this is actually a result from the fact that savings groups primarily engage women, and that in many societies it's actually the women's role then to take care of the children, and they then actually make those investments in children's health or education. Now, numerous evaluations actually have also shown that savings groups might or might not change existing power relations within couples and families. I have seen evaluations that talk about how increased money in the hands of women changes the way that men perceive them and the space that they are given in household decision making, and that they have greater respect because they have greater economic power. But at the same time, I have probably seen the same amount of evaluations that actually shows that giving women a greater hold of financial resources or more money actually increases also the risk for gender-based violence within couples and families. And as a matter of fact, it might actually also result in strengthening male power positions by simply allowing them to exercise authority over women's savings groups. And particularly in West Africa, where I'm based, I think we have seen an increased number of evaluations that show that increasingly men seem to getting hold over the money that has been saved by women. We also know that they can create double burden for women, because women actually do have to participate, or they participate in the savings group's activities, which can be time consuming. And at the same time, they are then expected to invest the money that they have raised rather than for their personal interest, maybe, they're expected to invest that then in children's health and education, rather than actually creating a fairer, more equitable ground for couples to decide what the money should be used for. We also have seen that in many instances, savings groups can be used as a platform for broader social change initiated by members. From my own work and plan, we have some fascinating examples where savings groups actually got together and used some of the savings to take initiative in favor, for example, of orphan children, or to work together to provide almost social protection to some vulnerable children and families at community level. And then we have also seen that they might indeed transform institutions that influence broader political agendas and challenge inequality. But that doesn't happen on its own, simply by bringing people together to save. That actually has to be accompanied by a much more conscious process. So to make savings groups work for social justice and greater equality, project design should really start applying a human rights-based approach to programming that is also at the heart of the SDGs now. And Bianca, if you move me on to the next slide, I'm going to talk a little bit about what the essence of such a human rights-based approach is, and what the consequential critical questions are when we design savings groups. So as a human rights-based approach has basically as the overall goal really the realization of human rights, and it follows a number of principles that include, amongst other, the principle of equality and non-discrimination. Nobody should be left out, and we should make conscious efforts to actually include those who would be otherwise left behind in the activities. So people must be active participants to the development process, and particularly those who might be, according due to their social status, otherwise excluded, be associated to the development process, to the design, to the monitoring and evaluation, and they must have a say in taking decisions at project level. Another very important principle is actually the principle of accountability and rule of law. And that speaks really to the fact that governments are primary duty bearers for the realization of human rights, and that they can be held accountable, and that they are being held accountable by those who have rights for their actions or their inactions to help realizing human rights. And that makes basically the overall outcome of work that is conducted with a human rights-based approach increased capacity of rights holders, that are people like you and I who have rights, to claim rights, so that they can actually negotiate with duty bearers such as government institutions to better fulfill their obligations. And that is really a paradigm shift. And I believe that savings groups methodology very often is still applied in a logic, let's fix some poor people's money problems, rather than helping savings groups to achieve greater social, economic, political empowerment and equality for the poor. And if we want to apply such a rights-based approach to savings groups, we really have to start right from the design phase some very critical questions. And the first one is certainly whose rights are at stake. And there I'm talking from Plan's own experience. We're a child rights organization, so we are primarily concerned with children. And we have, for many years, actually applied the savings groups methodology based on the assumptions that by putting more money into the hands or enabling members of savings groups, largely women, to have more money, that they would automatically invest in the right things that would actually benefit children's well-being. And that might well be the case. However, how this process really works and how we can make it better to really address the rights of the target group that we are aiming to impact at project level, that needs to be thought through in a much better way. Then, which rights are at stake, and what are the root causes for their non-realization? So what does have availability of money at household level actually has to do with the non-realization of rights? And that is a very tricky question, and that really forces us to look deep down at the assumptions of what savings groups can or should do as we implement them as part of broader projects that actually aim to increase children's education, for example, or their access to health services. And then thirdly, how do we believe savings groups will contribute to the realization of these rights? It's what I just discussed. And then the question is who participates, who doesn't, and why. And while we know that savings groups tend to work well with people who are more vulnerable, they probably still don't reach everywhere those who are the most vulnerable. And I know that there is a big thinking going on in savings groups methodology, and new approaches are being found to figure out how can we actually really exclude the most vulnerable, the most excluded, those who are described by the Sustainable Development goals as those furthest behind. And then who is really meant to reap the benefits of the initiative, and what needs to be done to ensure that this is happening. And that challenges us actually really around the assumption that by having a lot of women in savings groups, this would automatically benefit women themselves and their greater equality. And as a matter of fact, very often women don't use money for their own purposes, or they might not have a say on how the money is used at the end. And then who has a say in project design and decision making? How much do we associate people to the design process? And finally, how will the initiative indeed strengthen the capabilities and relationships between rights holders and duty bearers? And Jörg, yes, please do move on. So I've been talking about the fact that ideally all those questions should be already started to be answered right from the design process, and probably from the situation analysis that helps us to assess what is the context under which savings groups are actually being implemented. However, we found a really great example where a project actually did find out that probably with their project they were not on the right track, and where they made conscious measures to help improve their project design and their project implementation to make the project actually much more equitable, while at the same time increasing or improving the results of this work. So and this project is actually a project that is called Savings and Internal Lending Communities, SILC or SILC, a project that has been implemented in Zambia in partnership between CRS and CGIAR. And this project actually has added a gender transformative approach to the original savings groups methodology. And there actually CRS and CGIAR, they have actually questioned whether their project was indeed addressing the harmful gender norms and power relations that present obstacles to achieving sustainable and social and economic empowerment, especially for women. And they had identified a certain number of constraints related to gender that impacted both women's and men's successful participation in the project and their ability to reap maximum benefits from it. And these constraints included absenteeism and late arrivals to meeting due to the fact that women actually needed to complete domestic duties or other activities, members who only contributed to the mandatory social fund but not to savings, poor payback of loans, some men who actually prohibited their wives from joining, and men who tended to go fishing and were too busy to attend or join meetings. So there were a number of problems that they found related actually to gender inequality that resulted in poor performance of savings groups, in the poor performance of the application of the methodology, but also in poor outcomes. So together with Caritas, Promundo, World Fish, and facilitators from the Silk process, they designed a gender transformative approach that used participatory action research and particular sessions on gender-related topics that were piloted throughout the Silk group discussions. And these were designed not only to strengthen the individual understanding of group members on gender norms and how these influence their lives, but also to improve gender relations and functions of the savings groups. And you see this here at the top of this theory of change that they have developed. I just spoke to you about the constraints. Now you see their solution was to strengthen the SILK methodology with this gender transformative approach. And they wanted to achieve with this improved gender relations and functions of the SILK groups. And they expected that this would actually have a positive developmental impact, that it would create better gender relations within and outside the home, more and better investments in productive activities, thereby reducing poverty levels. Remember the SDGs, very important goal. And that SILK groups would actually be regarded as important entry points for other government and non-government development activities. And finally, that formal microfinance institutions would view SILK groups as important places to invest and grow and make broader and thus more inclusive microfinance services available. If you move on, Bianca, please. So they implemented these participatory action research and discussion sessions over a period of time. And the topics that they dealt with included violence reduction and anger preventions. They really looked at things happening at the family and at the couple level, because obviously gender equality cannot be achieved by just working with women alone. It's a two-way process that involves women as well as men. They looked at, as I said, couple relations. They had family visioning exercise where they really helped them to figure out what is it, what we want to achieve as a family, and how does gender socialization actually impacts our ability to achieve those goals as a family. And after having implemented those sessions for a while, they carried out an evaluation of the results, and they had some very promising early evidence of success. So they found, for example, that there was increased sharing of responsibilities, including childcare, between men and women in the group. They found that there was decreasing workload for some women due to sharing work with husbands or other family members, which allowed them to actually spend more time to the work of the savings groups. Then there was increased knowledge and knowledge sharing within the SILK groups, going beyond issues around savings. And obviously this is something that is then critical if we want to work with savings groups for other development purposes. There was increased cooperation around decision making within families, and indeed better management of income, because there were more sound decisions that were taken on how to invest the money. And then there was also an increased interest in participating in broader development activities at community levels. There was an increased show of respect amongst community members. And finally, in some households, there was actually an active recognition of the importance of gender. And I close here. I believe this is a great example of how or what has to be done if indeed we want to use savings groups to achieve broader goals, and if we want to be conscious about how within savings groups themselves we can contribute to much greater equality and thus the achievement of other goals as outlined in the SDGs, such as goals for gender equality, for example. And with this, to Bill of now.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you to Amanda and John. Really an excellent presentation. I want to remind everyone that the presentation slide deck will be available as a PDF after the broadcast, as well as a recording and a couple of related documents. One is Equal Rights for All Children, which is an internal document from Plan that gets into details of the drivers and barriers of change for a just and equitable world around an agenda for protection of children and children's rights. And also another paper that John is working on that's just in a draft stage, Impact Area Overview for the Right to Economic Security, another a really useful document to understand the strategy that Plan uses to focus on children and how the programs can be designed to make the greatest impact. We have a number of questions, and so I'll let you know it is 5 minutes before the hour. I think we'll go till 5 minutes after the hour, so if you have to leave at the top of the hour, then you can always come back and view the recording, but there are some excellent questions that I want to get to. So, and we'll just leave it up to the three of you to decide who would like to answer the questions, but the first one is coming from our friend Malcolm Harper. Malcolm says, one feature of savings groups which really appeals to me and others is that it is possible to promote them and then to leave them to flourish, evolve, and even multiply rather than to perpetuate the donor NGO presence. Studies in Nepal and Zanzibar showed that SGs could do this. Is this an outdated notion or perhaps one that appeals only to older people who no longer need to make a living out of development?
Let another older person speak, please. I think if your goal is to focus on financial services amongst community members and to build household assets and to improve household money management skills, that yes, the original model of savings groups that calls for intervention or connection with a project for 1 or 2 years is pretty valid, and you can then projects can go and leave these organizations, leave the groups. The groups tend to multiply, as we've seen from other studies, and they intend to kind of infuse the methodology within the community, or at least in the best cases they can do that. The question, though, becomes when groups ask the question, well, what next? What can we do beyond savings and credit? And I think this is when maybe a longer period of contact with an outside agency that can make options and strategies and actually action plans more evident to the group, to help them mobilize their resources and their energies and try to attack other problems in development. I think this can justify a longer-term relationship with outside agencies.
Without giving it away, that some of that topic will be discussed in our next webinar in June with Paul Rippey. We're still kind of formulating exactly what we're going to be covering, but we'll definitely be looking into that. Thank you, John. I also wanted to ask a question that Chimweme Kafangwane has asked. Has the SDGs tackled the inclusion from the persons with disability in the financial services issue?
Yeah, I'll take that. So specifically, no. There's no line that says that the SDGs will particularly aim to secure access to financial services for people with disabilities. However, there is a goal, or there is rather a target that talks about inclusion of all people, irrespective of age, sex, disability, race, ethnicity, origin, religion, or economic or other status, and to empower and promote their social, economic, and political inclusion. So that is in a way connected to that target, which is 10.2. There's also, though, a commitment within the SDGs that all of the measurement of the SDGs, the indicators, need to be disaggregated. And one of the disaggregations that's required within the SDGs is by disability. So that would be captured in any target that talked about access to financial inclusion through that type of disaggregation.
There's an excellent example of using savings groups to work with people with disabilities on a very large scale. Actually, that was part of this webinar series last year, co-hosted at the time by Oxfam US. And I believe, Bill, the presentation is on your is on your website. It's an example, or it's an experience that took place in Uganda, and hopefully is going to be spreading throughout Eastern and Southern Africa.
Yes, that is in our archives that are available on the website. Yep. Let's see. A number of different questions here. We won't be able to get to all of them. So I'm going to ask this question by Albert Mutasa, who says, I have nothing to take away from the wonderful and more fitting inclusive financial product. However, I wish to be a devil's advocate. Since most issues that drive women into vulnerability and poverty are more structural in nature, by designing a product which seems popular with the bottom billion, are we not institutionalizing poverty?
I'm not, I was sort of following the question until the last part there. I don't understand how this institutionalizes poverty.
Yeah, I'm maybe Albert can clarify a little bit. I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding that as well. Let's see.
I think
Go ahead.
Maybe what I can offer, maybe half of a response, at least how I'm understanding it. Indeed, if you look at women are disproportionately more or poorer than men, generally, and that's the case for children as well, right? So the question is probably what can be done to address those structural injustices, and I believe that an answer to this lies actually with the question, how can we address inequalities such as gender inequalities? And there, I believe what we've seen from the example that I have presented, it's becoming very clear that savings groups, by just giving money or helping women to have more money, we actually don't address the structural inequalities that are at the root cause for women's greater poverty levels worldwide. And this is why I believe there's a huge opportunity for savings groups to much more consciously think about how do we tackle gender inequalities that are really at the roots for women's disproportional level of poverty. How can we work in different ways in and around savings groups that address those issues?
Great. And there's a related question that Malcolm Harper asked, but I'm going to wait on it for right now. This is Jeffsky Pointsy. Good morning. I'm Jeffsky Pointsy. I am working as a livelihood and economic development manager for Plan International Haiti. I'm involved in designing and implementing savings group programs, and one of the challenges that we face is the fact that it's hard to keep people motivated without injecting a starting capital in the model. People don't have any income, and it's hard for them to save money and wait till 4 months to be able to borrow till the capital is significant. Do you have any advice that can help us address this challenge?
I don't know how the project you're talking about was designed, or how the community facilitators were trained. But if you're applying the VSLA model, which is the one that Plan uses, if you're applying that correctly, that problem should not arise, because in the preparatory work that you do with communities, it's very clear that all of this is savings-based, and that people, through the facilitation in preparing their groups, come to realize that, in fact, they do have small bits of money that can be saved. So I believe the problem here might be within the original design and the early implementation. Being a member of Plan, I'd like to see your situation and maybe help you correct it at some point.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm going to ask maybe two more questions here. Miriam Murray asks, for many years we have faced questions from beneficiaries of youth savings and lending groups. What's next? With this paradigm shift, how can we use VSL youth savings as a platform or foundation for promoting other human rights issues? How do we take this forward concretely for youth?
I think Stephanie gave a good prompt there in one of the charts that she showed, where one of the things that you need to do early on in the design process is to define what rights are being violated or are not being realized. In this case, Miriam, the rights that are that are associated with young people. And once you have a clear idea of what it is you want to address, you can sit down with youth and put in process a design that will address those, as the example from Zambia showed with gender transformation. But you need to do a thorough assessment of where the rights are coming up short, where they're not being realized, where people don't have the capacity to realize their rights. And once you answer those questions, you can build in a complement to savings and credit activities that may enable you to achieve your goals.
All right, well, there were a couple more, maybe 3 or 4 more questions, but I think we're going to wrap up.
Bill, there was one I saw asking if we had a model for working with youth in savings groups. And the answer to that is yes, we do. And I can send you that document. It's a rather extensive manual that we can send to you, and you perhaps can post it on the website.
Okay, great. And I want to remind people that we did just have a webinar. I think it was 2 webinars ago about this topic, talking specifically about plans, youth savings groups, and that is available on the website in the archive section. So go ahead and check that out. I want to thank our panelists, John Schiller, Amanda Lindy, and Stephanie Conrad for really an excellent presentation. We probably could have gone on for another half an hour or more with questions. I appreciate the questions that were asked. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your question. Appreciate your attentiveness, and want to remind you that there is a recording and related documents, the slide deck, etc., in the archives. You'll see that come up within a day or so at the SMDP webinar archive page. And stay tuned for our next webinar, which will be on June 8th with Paul Rippey and John Schiller, and we'll be talking about something connected to savings groups and new training models. And that's all I can say right now. I'm going to give you just a little tease. But again, thank you for everybody for your attendance, and have a good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. Thank you for attending the SMDP Plan webinar series.
Thanks a lot. Bye, everybody.
Goodbye, everyone.